All right.
Nice to meet you too.
It's the get to know you portion of the evening. Love it. Absolutely love it.
I've met you before. I know.
So while you're introducing yourself around, if anybody cannot sign up on the sheet when you walk in the door, please make sure you do that because I got to take a roll. All right. Larry, there's a seat right up here. Come on out. How are you, sir? Welcome to the fun house. It's gonna be good. Good. All right. So if you will come back together and let's have a seat and we'll talk for a few minutes. So, a couple things that I want to just kind of put up front so that everybody knows. I did tell you, like I said before, there's a couple of places on the web that you can kind of access or find us. And so I want to make sure that everybody has that access so that in case you happen to miss a class or you're not going to be here or whatever, then you know where to find the videos so that you can kind of keep up and keep with us. So we do have a Facebook page. The Facebook page is Apologetics at Cross Church Springdale. If you can type that in and find it, and if you go to try to join it, then it'll send me a little note, and I will let you in. I will make you part of the group. So it is a private group, but anybody can find it. So it's Apologetics at Cross Church Springdale, and anytime that we've got a message or something to go out, I put it on here first. And I know some people don't have Facebook, so that's why I take emails, so I can try to get emails out as well. Linked in here also is the website, which is, let me click over this, and it is the Cross Church Apologetics website. The URL for this is Cross Church Apologetics, all one word, .godaddysites.com. That is the website here. And a couple of places here that are going to be interesting to some of you. If you'll go to the About tab right there, I have a touch screen at school, which I get spoiled because I get to touch things, and it will just go where I want it to go. If you'll go to the About tab, on the About tab, you will see some documents here, and some of these documents are the hermeneutic material that we did last time. Yes, ma'am?
Will you say the URL one
Yes,
more time?
it is Cross Church Apologetics, all one word there, .godaddysites.com. That's Cross Church Apologetics .godaddysites.com.
SITES.
SITES, yes.
Sites.
Sites, SITES. So if you'll go here and you go to the About tab, then the first thing you'll see is there's a place for some downloads. And I've got some references here, some resources all about hermeneutics. But in case you do not have a copy of the Screwtape letters, I have a digital PDF right here of the Screwtape letters. So if you need a copy, I've got one right there for you. You can just go right there and download it, and that will be for you. I also have put on this site some links to some podcast material that I think you'll be interested in. One of them we're actually going to look at tonight. The first one is John Cleese and his Screwtape letters. Some years ago, John Cleese of Monty Python fame, yes, that very John Cleese, he actually did an entire dramatic reading of the entire book. And tonight we're actually going to listen to one of the letters, and as Cleese read them, is part of what we're going to do. But this is a link to, and I sent you the link to the podcast. There is the full recording on the podcast link is here. Now you can also find it on YouTube, but on YouTube some of the chapters are missing in the link. And so this has the entire thing compiled into one, so it's about 3.5 hours long if you have that kind of time. Also, this is a link to a version of the Screwtape letters that is actually dramatized. It's actors that are playing out the roles of Screwtape and Wormwood and the patient and everything else, and it's really fun to listen to. It is abridged because it is a dramatization, but it actually brings some life to some of the material there. So it's very interesting to listen to. So there's a link there for you to go and check that out. Then I've got some other podcast links that, as far as apologetics are concerned, I think you might be interested in. Stand to Reason is Greg Kugel's material. He wrote the book Tactics. If you're not familiar with that, that's a book you need to own. Unbelievable, this is Justin Brierley from the UK. Unbelievable podcast has been going now for, well, the Unbelievable radio show has been going for over 15 years. And this is marked by Justin Brierley always has usually a Christian and a non-Christian, and they are having a debate over some particular issue. And so it's a fantastic podcast to listen to. This podcast, Christianity Still Makes Sense, by Dr. Bobby Conway. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he wrote a few books, one called Doubting Towards Faith, which is an amazing book to read. My wife actually went to seminary with him, and so we've been following his career for a while. But in fact, the latest podcast on Christianity Still Makes Sense, he's talking about C.S. Lewis, so I thought it was a good one to put there as well. Reasonable Faith, this is the official podcast of Dr. William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith website. In fact, I've got two of his on here. The Reasonable Faith is the podcast of Reasonable Faith Ministry, and then the Defenders is Dr. Craig's apologetics class that he teaches at his church, but he records those, and that one's up here as well. Then there is the Elisa Childers podcast. She wrote Another Gospel. She wrote, what is the last one she wrote? Something about, it's not Live Not My Lives, that's Rod Dreher. But I have the book, I've read it, I just can't remember the title of it. But her podcast is good. Bible Thinker, this is Mike Winger from a church out in California. He was instrumental in helping me wrap my head around some of the Bible translation material that we looked at last year, and so I'd say go check him out. And then down here at the bottom is J. Warner Wallace, Cold Case Christianity. If you're not familiar with Mr. Wallace, he was a cold case detective for years, and he applies his cold case knowledge to first just the Christian faith itself, and he's written quite a few books since then. His latest book, which came out a couple years ago now, called Person of Interest, he actually outlines and lays out the case for why Jesus came at the perfect time for the gospel to be spread exactly like it was. And it's a fantastic read. It's easy to read, and it's something that I think you should all check out. So definitely go and give all of this a listen. It's more there than you can stomach in about a week probably, but there's a lot to choose from. So I wanted to make those available to you as well. So with that, what I'd like to do now is I would like to talk a little bit about why the Screwtape letters and why we chose this, why we chose Lewis, and what seems to be the whole point of why we're doing this. I don't think I need to tell anybody in the room that we are living in a day and time that is quite possibly unlike any other than this planet has ever seen. And yet at the same time, every time that we kind of look up and every time we think, gosh, I don't think things can get any worse, one of the things we learned is that they do, and that they have in the past. And what makes it so interesting is that all of the strange things, all of the dark things, all of the hard things that we deal with in our culture today, there's nothing really new under the sun. We've seen it. And we've seen it time and again. There are people who have written about it. Maybe not in the exact same way, but it's there. And so one of the things that I try to stress upon my students at school when we're learning is we need to go back and we need to look at our history, because we can learn things from those who came before us. We absolutely can. We absolutely should. We can learn things from those who have dealt with the same kind of troubles, the same kind of problems. And for people who want to deny that there is an absolute spiritual war going on, they don't read much. In fact, they definitely don't pick up the Bible and read it, because it's all over our scriptures. But it's all over a lot of other literature too. Case in point. In fact, not just literature, but I mean, let's be honest. How many of you, over the course of the past couple of months, saw the billboard that was on I-49 that says, abortions save lives?
Yes.
See the billboard? Anybody pay attention as to who sponsored the billboard? Some of y'all got my text message. Who was it? The Satanic Temple.
Ugh.
The Satanic Temple. In fact, if you went to the website that was on the billboard, it took you straight to a Satanic Temple website for abortion care to teach you how to claim that your abortion was going to be a protected right under the First Amendment as a religious ritual. Okay? Go ahead and tell me we're not in the spiritual fight. You can't do it. Okay? Even my 12-year-old sees this billboard, looks at me and goes, Dad, that's not right. I said, you're absolutely correct, that's not right. Why isn't it right? And he can tell me. But the fact that my 12-year-old saw it, it's like, why would they do that? And I had to explain to my 12-year-old. Because not everybody understands life the way we do. Not everybody understands the world that we live in the way we do. And not everybody's going to. But we have to. We have to, because we are called. We are called to be people of the book, and we are called to be those that walk in the light. And just 2 weeks ago, we read what I consider to be the most important passage in all of Scripture on spiritual warfare. So if you'll do me a favor and turn to Ephesians chapter 6 very quickly. It's a familiar passage. It's one that everybody should be familiar with. If you've been sitting in our services for a while, we went through the entire book of Ephesians. But boy, we got to chapter 6, and this is heavy, and it's heavy stuff. And sometimes I think people kind of treat it a little too flippantly. They just kind of read it in passing. But I want us to read this again, because this right here is the reason why we began looking at not just warfare, but looking at how we can learn about it. Not just from Lewis, but going back to Scripture as well. So here it is. This is Ephesians chapter 6. I'm going to start with verse 10. Finally. It's a very strong word, finally. It means Paul's giving you his last thing. Be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. Not if, mind you, but when. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the full armor of God so that you will be able to resist in the evil day, and having done everything, to stand firm. Stand firm, therefore, having girded your loins with truth, having put on the breastplate of righteousness, having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. In addition to all, taking up the shield of faith with which you will be able to extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And with all prayer and petition, pray at all times in the Spirit, and with this in view, be on the alert, with all perseverance and petition for all the saints. And pray on my behalf, that utterance may be given to me in the opening of my mouth, to make known with boldness the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that in proclaiming it I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. Make no mistake, Paul wrote that chained to Roman soldiers under house arrest, knowing that his fight had nothing to do with the people he was chained up next to, knowing that the fight he was in was with powers and principalities that most people couldn't fathom if they saw them for real. And yet, we are bombarded with them every single day. C.S. Lewis writes the Screwtape letters, and it's a fantastic story, okay? How many of you have read the Screwtape letters before? Okay, most of you in the room have read it. If you haven't, my first suggestion to you is read the story, and read it for what it is. It is a very interesting, it's a very interesting piece of literature to read. But there's some history behind this book that a lot of people don't know. And I want to give you some of that history because I want you to understand the backdrop in which we find ourselves. So, some of y'all like to jot some things down. This will be kind of an interesting thing to kind of get into, but let me set the stage for you. The year is 1940, okay? 1940, and C.S. Lewis is living in England. He has been a Christian for a little while now, but he did not start that way. Most of you may know this, but C.S. Lewis's life started out very, very rough. He was pretty much fine until about the age of 6. His mother gets sick and dies. He prays for his mother to get well, and she doesn't. And that was pretty much the end of his thought about religion in any kind. He became, as he grew up as a child, he became a vociferous atheist, because he could not fathom the idea that there would be a loving God who would let his mother die when he was a child. And he argued with everyone he could. From everything that we know, he argues and argues and argues with as many people as he can, because there's just no way that a rational thinking person can believe in a God that would do something like let a child's mother die. And then he meets this really interesting man by the name of J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien meets Lewis right where he's at, because I don't know how much of Tolkien y'all have read, but that man is a genius too. And they got to talking, and they realized that they had a lot in common. But Tolkien was a believer, and Lewis was not. But through their friendship, and through their discussions, and through their arguments, Tolkien led Lewis to Christ. And once C.S. Lewis admitted what he had known all along, that God had been pursuing him, and that God had reached out and touched him, then he became just as vociferous of a believer as he was an atheist. He and Tolkien and a few others formed a group called the Inklings, and they were at Oxford. And in fact, the coffee shop where they would go and sit and debate and argue is still there. You can still go there. There's still material there. This is where the Inklings were. And I just, when I think about that, I just think about what it would have been like to have been sitting having coffee next to these two men. Can you imagine? Like, what would the small talk be like between Lewis and Tolkien? What are they talking about? I mean, Lewis is writing Out of the Silent Planet, and Tolkien is, I'm going to create a new language this week and write Elvish, okay? That was in the 1940s. This is 2023. I have to tell kids not to eat Tide Pods. Okay, how far have we dropped here? It's a little bit crazy. Well, the year's 1940, and Hitler has just made his speech that was broadcast to the whole of Europe. And the speech was basically Hitler saying, either get out of my way or I'm coming to get you, all of you. And it was directed at Great Britain. He and a friend he had a friend over to actually listen to the speech. And he admitted later that, wow, the rhetoric was so high and the emotion of it all was so persuasive that he almost was persuaded by the things he heard. That's Hitler in 1940, okay? So he's just heard this speech from Hitler, and then he gets sick. He can't go to church for a while, he can't do much, about 3 weeks. And when he finally gets well enough to be able to go back to church, he wakes up on a Sunday morning and he realizes he's overslept. How many of y'all have ever overslept? Yeah. How many of y'all overslept and missed church? Hey, I'll raise my hand on that one too. All right? So you're in good company because Lewis did it too. But he wakes up and he realizes he's overslept, and it makes him a little angry. And I wish I was making this up. You cannot make stuff like this up. He's angry because if he wants to go to church, now he has to go to the 11 o'clock service, not the 8 o'clock service. The church he was going to had two, and he did not want to go to the 11 o'clock service because, and this is the quote, the organist picked all the smarmy hymns and he did not want to deal with it. He hated the music. He's like, he just didn't want to deal with it. But he got up and he went anyway. So he goes to church that Sunday morning. It's not the service he wants to go to. He's already mad because he slept in late. The organist that he can't stand is there. And then the preacher, whom he referred to as someone I have no use for, because apparently this preacher was a more liberal preacher at the time, but he wrote, I have no use for this man. So the preacher gets up to speak. Now, here, put yourself in the position. He woke up late. He's got to go to service he doesn't want to go to. He hates the music. The preacher he thinks is useless. He's not paying attention. And by his own admission, he's just doodling the whole time. But while he's doodling in the service, paying no attention to what's going on, this interesting thought hits him. And by the time he walks out of church that morning, he's got an idea. And he's got an idea about writing a story that comes from an elder devil explaining how to tempt a human being to a younger devil. And it was this idea that would blossom into what we now call the Screwtape letters. Now, when this was done, if you got the book, you know this is written in 31 different letters. There are 31 letters in the book. They were not published as a book. They were published as single letters. And they were published first in an Anglican periodical called The Guardian. And in May of 1941, okay, war is now going on in Europe. The U.S. has not quite entered the war yet, but war is everywhere in Europe. And in May of 1941, he's writing these letters, and each one gets published every week, once a week for 31 weeks. And they are wildly popular. Wildly popular. However, and once again, this is something you can't make up, there were people at the time who wrote into this Anglican periodical and canceled their subscription because they thought that the letters were real, and they could not understand why somebody was telling another person to do all these dastardly evil things, and they didn't understand why the Anglican periodical was putting it out there, so they're done. We don't want your magazine anymore. And I'm thinking, they didn't read that it was like this demon to this other demon. They didn't. People are people. So after that was done, all 31 letters were gathered up. And publishing company, one of the publishing companies that wanted it was out of New York. And there were a couple others. He was afraid, however, that in the height of the war, that the manuscript would get lost. So what he did is he sent there was a typed copy and there was a handwritten copy. He sent the typed copy to the publisher, and he sent the handwritten copy to a nun friend of his in the hopes that one would survive. And interestingly enough, the handwritten copy was, if I learned right, the handwritten copy was found in a library somewhere maybe like 20, 30 years ago, and nobody ever knew that the handwritten copy had existed. But wow, to be able to look at that would be incredible. But he also said that it was the hardest book for him to write, as well as the easiest book for him to write. He called it the easiest because it was almost flowed right off the pen. But he said it was the hardest because one of the reasons it made it so easy is he just took out all the virtues that he believed in. Because see, if you remove yourself from the idea of all the virtues, then you can write from the diabolical. But he said it made him dry and itchy and gritty, and it stirred something in his soul that was just dark. And that's really interesting, because if you spend all your time focusing on things that are dark, it's going to affect you. Well, here's C.S. Lewis, this giant of a Christian writer, and he wrote this amazing story that we have that has followed us through time, and yet he's telling us, it took a lot out of me to write this. In fact, he almost quit. He almost didn't finish it. The war is going on, and the war intensifies. After he publishes the Screwtape letters, he gets asked to start traveling to military bases around Europe to speak. And as he would speak on different military bases, the words that he would speak and the speeches he would give were recorded and were broadcast by the BBC. All of the speeches that he gave at these military bases over the course of the next year were compiled into what we know now as the book Mere Christianity. So I want you to understand that the two books we're about to dive into come from a huge time of humanity's upheaval. It is a wartime novel. It is a wartime apologetic. He did not write in a vacuum, and so we can't look at it from a vacuum. And once we get into the letters, you're going to see there's a lot of discussion about war, and this is why. Because World War II was in full swing as he was writing this material. So we can't forget that, okay? We can't forget that, yes, we are reading a book about spiritual warfare, but he is making equations to actual war that's going on. And we need to make sure we keep that in our mind as we look at the work. I don't know about you, but that's an uplifting story to me in and of itself, because it kind of makes me think, wow, if I zoned out during the sermon last week, maybe I'll get a really cool book to write one day. But it also goes to show me that God brings inspiration in His time. Okay? It's not my time, it's not your time, it's not anybody else's time, it's God's time. And when God is ready, and He knows that we're ready, then incredible things can happen. My prayer for what we're about to do here is that we will be as enjoyable as we can possibly be, that we will enjoy our discussions, we will enjoy the time together, but we will never lose sight of the fact that we are about to talk about something and dig into something that for many people it's very difficult and they don't want to. Okay? They don't. It's very easy, and I know some of you will know exactly what I'm saying when I say it. It's very easy for us to get into a mindset of talking about spiritual warfare from a distracted and a distant perspective. It's very easy for us to say, hey, I just read this Bible verse about the armor of God, but those things are out there. They don't really touch me. I'm not going to have to deal with that. And you don't think about it like that. But honestly, that's how it gets treated in most churches. Okay? We read it, but we're not really serious about it. Okay? And I'm just going to be straight up with you. If I were to ask you, and don't raise your hand right now, some of you may want to raise your hand later, but if I were to ask you right now, have any of you absolutely positively had an encounter with something that you knew was demonic? Some of you will be real honest and say, yep, I have. And some of you will be a little reticent to tell me, because maybe you're not sure. And some of you aren't going to say anything because, oh my gosh, what if they really knew? I will be the first one. And some of you, those of you that know me, this is not a new story. I have encountered the demonic. And it is not something I share with everybody. Why? Because I know that most people cannot deal with that. They can't. And I know you know I'm right. Okay? I'm guessing you know that too. You cannot just pop in front of everybody and go, I saw a demon last week. No, that doesn't work. Okay? It doesn't work. But when I hear people say things that are irrational, like, wow, I would really love to see something like that. I'd really love to see something like this happen. You know what? You can tell me you want to see the power of God, and I will be all for it. But if I ever hear anybody say they want to see something demonic, I cut that off immediately and go, no, you do not. That's not something you wish for. It's not something you pray for. That's not something you want to encounter. It's a scary thought. It's a scary thing. And it's real. In fact, it's more real than what Lewis calls the real world. One of the things that we're going to look at in just a minute is letter number 1. And right at the beginning of this book, what you're going to see is there's a huge distinction between what is actually real and what the demons themselves call the real world, because there's the mundane and there's the spiritual. And I guarantee you the spiritual is far more real than the mundane. But we don't ever think about that because we're too wrapped up in the mundane. Okay? How do I know that? Real simple. I have to watch that clock, because I know that come 7:30, we got to be done. Why? Some of us in here have kids. We got to go get them. We got school tomorrow. There's stuff to do. Guess what? There's always stuff to do. There will always be stuff to do. And sometimes the spiritual doesn't work on our timetable. But we have to take it into account. We have to think about what's the difference between what is truly real and what is the mundane. So we're going to look at that here in a minute too. It is a discussion that is usually left up to pastors and preachers who either preach out of the text we read before and do a fantastic job and give the wonderful exegesis, and we learn, and it's fantastic, and yes, we're going to pray the armor on, and we're going to do that every day, and then it goes away and we don't hear about it again for 6 months. Or sometimes it gets used by pastors and preachers who are going to dig really, really deep into the idea of something really, really dark, because it's time to scare you and make sure that you understand hellfire and brimstone is breathed down your neck, and it's time to get right, turn or burn. We've heard it all. Okay? The hard part is that all of those things are true, and yet we got to find the balance, because Lewis makes a really interesting claim in the preface to his book, because he says most people think about the demonic in one of two ways. They either get so wrapped up in it that they have this unhealthy obsession, or they just pass it off and don't pay attention to it at all. Neither is okay. The unhealthy obsession will take you places you never wanted to go, and if you pass it off, there's nothing there, you're going to find yourself in places you never thought you would be. So we've got to take it serious. And that's what we're going to do. So as we now take a turn into letter number 1, okay? And so if you've got a copy of it, you can open it up. If you don't have a copy of it, we're going to actually listen to letter number 1 being read, okay? And I want us to listen to and think about what's being said as we take a look into letter number 1. This is the beginning. Okay, if you read the whole book, great, but this is the start. This is where we are introduced to our main characters. We have Screwtape and we have Wormwood. Screwtape is the elder demon. Screwtape is the one that is giving all the advice to his young nephew. Now, I don't really understand how demons have nephews, but that's okay. We'll deal with that later. All right. But he's giving some interesting advice to his young nephew, Wormwood. And they're going to talk about the patient. I find it very interesting that he refers to humanity as patients. That's something we'll unpack a little bit as we go as well. But we're going to talk about the patient, and what's going on with the patient, and what kind of temptations is Wormwood able to bring in front of the patient, and how do they work and how do they not work. But this is the beginning of the story. And as we listen and as you read along, I want you to think about two things. Number one, I want you to think about the immediate. Okay? What is Lewis trying to tell us from the different things we're about to hear? The reading is about 7 minutes long. What is Lewis trying to tell us right now, in this moment, with what we're trying to hear? Okay? He wrote it back in 1940, 1941. What do you think he was trying to say at that particular moment? But here's the second thing I want you to think about. Culturally speaking, 2023, right now, what would this sound like if it were written today? Okay? Think about these two things. Let's listen to letter number 1.
Five words you pronounce wrong.
First, we have an ad.
Before your
Sorry.
brain starts shutting down. Dementia is now known.
Audio Literature presents The Screwtape Letters, read by John Cleese.
I'd like first to read the preface written by C.S. Lewis at Magdalen College on July the 5th, 1941. I have no intention of explaining how the correspondence which I now offer to the public fell into my hands. There are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence, the other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased by both errors, and hail a materialist or a magician with the same delight. The sort of script which is used in this book can be very easily obtained by anyone who has once learned the knack, but ill-disposed or excitable people who might make a bad use of it shall not learn it from me. Readers are advised to remember that the devil is a liar. Not everything that Screwtape says should be assumed to be true, even from his own angle. I have made no attempt to identify any of the human beings mentioned in the letters, but I think it very unlikely that the portraits, say, of Father Spike or the patient's mother are wholly just. There is wishful thinking in hell as well as on earth. In conclusion, I ought to add that no effort has been made to clear up the chronology of the letters. Number 17 appears to have been composed before rationing became serious, but in general, the diabolical method of dating seems to bear no relation to terrestrial time, and I have not attempted to reproduce it. The history of the European war, except insofar as it happens now and then to impinge upon the spiritual condition of one human being, was obviously of no interest to Screwtape. Letter 1. My dear Wormwood, I note what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. Now, that might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not, and if it was proved, they really believed it. They still connected thinking with doing, and were prepared to alter their way of life as the result of a chain of reasoning. But what with the weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. Your man has been accustomed, ever since he was a boy, to having a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside his head. He doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or ruthless. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Don't waste time trying to make him think that materialism is true. Make him think it is strong or stark or courageous, that it is the philosophy of the future. That's the sort of thing he cares about. The trouble about argument is that it moves the whole struggle onto the enemy's own ground. He can argue too, whereas in really practical propaganda of the kind I'm suggesting, he has been shown for centuries to be greatly the inferior of our Father below. By the very act of arguing, you awake the patient's reason, and once it is awake, who can foresee the result? Even if a particular train of thought can be twisted so as to end in our favor, you will find that you have been strengthening in your patient the fatal habit of attending to universal issues and withdrawing his attention from the stream of immediate sense experiences. Your business is to fix his attention on the stream. Teach him to call it real life. And don't let him ask what he means by real. Remember, he is not, like you, a pure spirit. Never having been a human, that abominable advantage of the enemies, you don't realize how enslaved they are to the pressure of the ordinary. I once had a patient, a sound atheist, who used to read in the British Museum. One day, as he sat reading, I saw a train of thought in his mind beginning to go the wrong way. The enemy, of course, was at his elbow in a moment. Before I knew where I was, I saw my 20 years' work beginning to totter. If I had lost my head and begun to attempt a defense by argument, I should have been undone. But I was not such a fool. I struck instantly at the part of the man that I had best under my control and suggested that it was just about time he had some lunch. Now, the enemy presumably made the counter-suggestion, you know, how one could never quite overhear what he says to them, that this was more important than lunch. At least, I think that must have been his line, for when I said quite, in fact, much too important to tackle at the end of a morning, the patient brightened up considerably. And by the time I had added, much better come back after lunch and go into it with a fresh mind, he was already halfway to the door. Once I showed him a newsboy shouting the midday paper and a number 73 bus going by, and before he reached the bottom of the steps, I had got into him an unalterable conviction that whatever odd ideas might come into a man's head when he was shut up alone with his books, a healthy dose of real life, by which he meant the bus and the newsboy, was enough to show him that all that sort of thing just couldn't be true. He knew he had a narrow escape, and in later years was fond of talking about that inarticulate sense for actuality, which is our ultimate safeguard against the aberrations of mere logic. He is now safe in our Father's house. You begin to see the point? Thanks to processes which we set at work in them centuries ago, they find it all but impossible to believe in the unfamiliar while the familiar is before their eyes. Keep pressing home on him the ordinariness of things. Above all, do not attempt to use science, I mean the real sciences, as a defense against Christianity. They will positively encourage him to think about realities he can't touch and see. There have been sad cases among the modern physicists. If he must dabble in science, keep him on economics and sociology. Don't let him get away from that invaluable real life. But the best of all is to let him read no science, but to give him a grand general idea that he knows it all and that everything he happens to have picked up in casual talk and reading is the results of modern investigation. Do remember, you are there to fuddle him. From the way some of you young fiends talk, anybody would suppose it was our job to teach. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.
This is a metabolite.
Okay, so I gave you another handout that says study questions on it. If you'll pull that out, right there, letter number 1, there are a few questions there that I want you to just kind of look at. And what I'd like you to do now is I want you to take a couple minutes, and I have a feeling you've all got some pretty interesting takes on what you just heard, what you read. I'd like for you to maybe look at a couple of these questions, and maybe one jumps out at you like, oh wow, I really, this is something that resonated with me. But take a moment, and then I want you to kind of turn around, grab a couple people next to you, and I want you to just talk about what your impressions are. What do you think about all this? What do you think about what was just said? And a couple of those study questions, maybe you've got an answer for. So we'll give you a couple minutes. I want you to talk to your neighbors, and I want you just to get some of your ideas out, and then we're going to come back, and I'm going to ask you to kind of report back. I want to hear what you have to say about Screwtape's first letter. So take a couple minutes, look at the study questions, grab a couple people around you, and some of you are already focused and looking at people, which is good. But I want you to talk for a minute. Talk about your first impressions and what you think. This is your time to kind of get a little conversation going. I'm going to step back and let you talk, and then I'm going to come back and we'll ask a few questions. So, find a friend, make a conversation. Let's go. Form up.
Talk amongst yourselves.
I don't have a particular question here, except to say that when you talked about the issue of not using argument, I just read about a book on propaganda. It's all about not arguing, it's all about feelings. That's how you win this.
Yes.
Today, we know the liberal, they will not discuss, they will not debate, none of that. They'll just get typing and scream at people.
It's all about feelings. No facts whatsoever.
No facts. No facts.
They don't want you to know.
It's what my truth is. My truth. I've said it's true.
That's right. Yeah.
That's the only way to understand this crazy building.
They way to manipulate. In what ways do you think the directors of the work is susceptible to diabolical influence? To make, because I get involved in, and I'm guilty of this too, just getting involved in the ordinary things of life, and I don't mean to not pay attention to things, but it's just, you get so wrapped up, you know what I'm saying? Just in like the ordinary and just all the stuff that you gotta do, that I think that's the way that I think of this type of justice. Where we're
Every time I was in the newspaper, I was wondering what about the internet.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you can literally escape into any universe via the internet be it television, movies, you can just escape to wherever and not deal with it. When you think back to our forefathers, all they had was books. And they had time. They worked, they were on the farm. When the sun went down, they would sit with the oil lamps that was lit. We're watching TV and on the internet.
Video games.
Video games. Whatever.
Social media.
Facebook and everything, right? I mean, they say some children are like 3 or 4 hours a day on the internet or Facebook or whatever. And studies that they're on Facebook.
If you have a 6-year-old, and you have to seriously
Yeah.
how much time are desk and monitor that.
Yeah.
Sit down and practice.
That's what happened to that. There's different things they got on. He has some actual video games. Things that they're online playing every single day and every night. That's kind of a blessing.
That he doesn't like. But I think that's how we've been super involved in his life. You have to put down. You have to
Because he's going to do whatever he likes to do. And they make these video games so addictive. The thing is,
Spending millions of dollars for your health.
they think manipulation, all advertising is based on theories of there's no difference between advertising and executive propaganda. They follow the same rules. I was reading here recently that since World War I, the advertising / propaganda industry has perfected it so they know exactly how they can market.
That's scary.
For 90 years they've been working on this.
Well, you see before that, think about the yellow journalism back in the day.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's been locked out.
But they had to convince America and Britain to go into war. That's when they got serious. And they got the media, they got the artists, they got the Actors Guild, they got the writers, they got all these different groups of folks in the society all together to figure out how are we going to convince these countries together. That's what they
You all read the book?
I haven't yet. I think I did when I was a kid.
Yeah.
I haven't read it.
I've read some of the letters here and there. It's been just
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how we had it. Wednesday night was
I still have hair. I remember having hair, but I don't remember exactly what my life
on all the horrible that happened. Is it they told the children not to do it. You gotta do this. This will protect you from this, from this, horrible thing happening. You gotta get on these trains, you gotta get out of here, because it's going to protect you. It was a total lie. But that's I don't want to say no with the changes.
I'm gonna hit my head on that thing. I know I am.
Yes.
Okay, I'm listening.
I just wanted to say that I just ran across a book about propaganda. And propaganda is all about not dealing with the facts, not logical, not rational, all about feelings. Well, at the moment I can't remember.
There's a really good one called "Live Not by Life" by Rob Barrett.
Oh, yeah, it's not that.
It goes in the same type of material.
It's mixed quality.
I love to read it. See how they're doing over here.
What do they say about COVID? Say anything about
I know they should my claims out, but I don't want to talk to teachers here.
Oh, propaganda. Well, I just read I didn't buy it. They started like $18. But I get an idea what it's about. Anyway,
I'm 18 books behind on my Kindle, so I got great reading list ahead of me.
So what I know from other books about COVID is it's one mass propaganda war. Fauci and Bill Gates to have COVID.
That is so scary. I mean, that is just
And listen to this. Bill Gates had the patents on the vaccines in 2017 on the government website. So he had the patents for the vaccine. This was all planned. Oh yeah. Yeah. And meanwhile, the media has continued to lie. Trying to help save mankind. You know his father started a population control organization. That's what he was in India. He had vaccines in India and making vaccines for typhoid.
All right, so man, fantastic conversations going on here, and I love it. So let's kind of come back together, and I want to get some impressions, and I'm gonna go around because I heard some really amazing things from around the room. But one of the things that pretty much everybody was talking about was this idea of the ordinary and the mundane. So I'm curious. I want to hear from you, and we'll start. I don't care where we start. Contrary to what I do in my other classroom, I'll let you choose, and then if nobody wants to speak, then I will call on someone. But no, what's your impression here? A lot of you seem to get real into this idea of the ordinary and the distractions of it. So I'd like to hear. I want other people to hear what you've been talking about. So who wants? Anybody want to share out what you were discussing?
We're talking over in our group about just day-to-day living. Righteousness, or the attempt to achieve, because none of us are ever going to be righteous, but
speak for yourself. No,
the attempt to be righteous, to be like God, it requires a lot of intentionality.
Sure.
Even just your day-to-day life, and if you take. Paul writes, if you take your eye off the prize, or you're going to be straight. So to remain focused in a world where you wake up, you go to work, you got kids, you're getting them to school, you got social media, movies, blah, blah, you know, ball games, that, it's just laundry never stops. You know, we were joking about that with you all ago, laundry that it's never done.
Yeah.
And so it's just to take the time, if you're not intentional with taking the time to have the relationship with God, sin comes natural. We can sin unconsciously.
Yep.
But righteousness has to be a conscious effort. And so I think with the mundane, with the all this that we're talking about, it distracts us from our intentionality.
So let me ask this question. This is for the whole room. I think everybody that I listen to would absolutely agree with that. Let me pose this question about the mundane and the ordinary. Is there ever a time where the mundane and the ordinary are absolutely necessary?
When you're raising small children.
Okay, so
That was our exact conversation.
okay, then expound upon that. What do you mean by that? If the mundane and the ordinary are absolutely necessary when you're raising small children, what do you mean?
Well, they're dependent on you, and so.
Do your children know that you call them ordinary?
I think that the challenge, speaking as a mom, not of young children anymore, thank goodness, but the challenge is how to do that in a way that you're trying to still be righteous and godly and not let those things drag you down because they have to be done. Your children are counting on you to feed them and to do their laundry and to just take care of their needs. And so,
Yeah, they can't feed themselves.
yeah.
They can't change themselves. They can't dress themselves. So
Yeah,
of course.
and it's hard because I think for Christians, you know, he mentions the one person that managed to get into hell, and so, you know, for a Christian, we're saved, but how effective can we be if we're bogged down in the
Oh, wait till letter number 2. Wait till letter 2.
And so I think that one of the things I wrote down was distractions and chaos. I kept thinking the word chaos as we were listening, and that's at least what the devil does with me. He gets me kind of hooked into a frenzy and frazzled, so I can't think straight, and then I'm ineffective.
But
So-
see, Matt, right?
Yep.
Matt and I are on the same wavelength. So what is the first thing that God created in the Garden of Eden? In the Garden of Eden, right? The family. So the family is our first ministry. Everybody's like, oh, you need to serve a church, and that's all great, family, but your family should be our first ministry. In fact, in the Bible, God even said to, there was a checklist. It's great if you desire the office of a bishop, but what are the criteria to be a bishop? You have to run your home well.
Yeah.
So obviously God thought the family should come first. So our family is our first ministry, and serving our family and teaching children to have a relationship with God. It is the mundane and the ordinary, but it's serving God in the mundane and the ordinary. It's just as important as going to somebody's house and helping them pray out, an evil spirit from their home. In fact, it's more important.
I agree with that.
Because you're establishing the foundation of their life.
So let's take that one step further.
Well, but in James, to expound upon that, even says that if you're a slave, serve your master as if you're serving under the Lord.
Yep. Paul writes about that as well. But there will come a moment, and here's where I'm gonna be the devil's advocate tonight. There will come a moment where that ordinary and that mundane and that biblical mandate will become something that we idolize instead of work to the glory of God. And then the question becomes, how do we find the line? How do we know that we've gone from this was the ordinary and this is what we need to do and what we're supposed to do and what we're called to do when we step over that line into, but now it's all about me? Because that's when we get into trouble. What would have been ordinary in 1940s war-torn Europe?
Finding food, survival.
Getting food.
The radio.
Getting food, the radio, survival.
Areas.
Air raid sirens. Okay? Do you think it's possible that maybe sometimes when those air raid sirens went off, people were just walking around going, oh, there it is again? I would propose that that happened only up until the bomb actually dropped. And once the bomb dropped, nobody's walking around like that was an ordinary thing anymore. Because it wasn't. All of a sudden, it became the extraordinary. Now think about that moment. He's writing this. This is the moment that he's writing it in, and he's telling, this demonic character is telling the reader that if we can get them focused on the ordinary, then they won't focus on the bigger issues. Well, oh my gosh. If the world around you is going to hell in a handbasket because the world is at war, all you're trying to do is cling to what's ordinary to keep your sanity. So he's literally telling you that the very thing that is supposed to be helping you survive right now is what the devil can use to distract you. And that's a whole different level. Because if you start thinking about, oh my gosh, even survival could be a problem, I don't have any breath at that point. Now I love the way that I love the way that y'all talked about reading this, because both of you, separately from each other, y'all should meet, both of y'all separately from each other, talked about how much it bothered you reading this. What was it about the reading that was the problem?
The enemy.
What? Expound upon yourself.
Well, when I'm taking notes and we were talking about the diabolical versus the heavenly, is that how you worded it? Strategies. I'm writing the enemy, use it, wait,
What
God.
are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly. And that felt gross.
It does feel gross, doesn't it? Lewis said it made him itch all over to do that.
That's just the first one.
But yeah, I told her it gets worse. It gets worse. But this is the enemy. And if this is the enemy talking, then how much worse could it really get? It could get way worse. And we know that. Now, take a step back into the 21st century. Okay? Let's talk about worse for a second. I brought this up before, I won't bring it up again. How many of y'all saw the Grammys this past year? Oh, see, y'all are, thank God you didn't see it. You know what happened. If you didn't see it live, blessings be to you. But if you did see it, you want to talk about gross and feeling gross? The enemy was in full display, and they weren't even trying to hide. Okay? Go look up 2023 Grammys on YouTube and just get a glimpse of Sam Smith's performance.
Well, CBS came out and tweeted it's time to worship.
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
They absolutely did. And it was full-on demonic like I've never seen on TV before. Okay? So yeah, it got worse. Because they're not even trying to hide anymore. But sometimes the overt, like we've just discovered, is not what's necessary. Because we can look at that and go, we gotta turn that off. I'm not even bringing that in my house. But while we turn off the overt, sometimes we get too focused on that mundane, and we lose sight of the real.
That mundane has been brought before us from birth. They talked about working on his patient for 20 years.
Right.
You know, we talked about being born sinful, and so everything they bring into our thoughts as we progress through life, Christian or not, they can steer us off.
So they can.
And it's because that's our nature.
And you know what's even scarier than that? Sometimes we don't even need the devil to do it. We're really good at it ourselves too.
I want to derail you.
Huh?
I want to derail you.
You gonna derail me?
Yeah.
I'll give you 2 minutes.
It's kind of number 5.
Number 5?
Yes.
Okay.
He mentions in his letter that like they can hear the patient's thoughts. And there's some theologians that I've heard that always have believed that God can hear our thoughts, but the enemy cannot. I have found no scriptural support one way or the other, but
it's a speculative moment on Lewis's part. But what I find really interesting is not so much that the enemy could possibly hear the thought of the patient, but that they cannot hear the thoughts of God. That, I think, is even more telling. Because whether or not they can think, whether or not they can hear everything going on in our heads, I don't know. but they do not know the mind of God. And what's so interesting to me is that we have the book where we can. We have the Holy Spirit where we have been given access to the mind of Christ. And yet they have not.
Didn't Satan tempt Jesus and use scripture sometimes?
Jesus was human. And if he had not been tempted, then he could not say that he had been tempted. The Bible could not say he'd been tempted in every way that we were. By the way, did you all pick up on the really interesting phrase in letter 1 about Jesus' humanity? What was the phrase? Do you remember?
The advantage.
What, not just an advantage, the abominable advantage. Wasn't that great? It's the abominable advantage, because the enemy knows that they cannot be as we are, and they can never be as he is. And yet, he became as we are to save us. And oh my gosh, you know that's got to be a huge source of contention. I love the abominable advantage. That's huge. That's a huge little moment to kind of focus on. Let me give you 5 things. I want you to jot these 5 things down, okay? Let me give you 5 really quick things, because we could deal with letter 1 until the sun went down. But let me give you 5 quick things that I want you to take away from this, that I want you to think about, and we will revisit letter 1 briefly next week before we go into 2 and 3. But let me give you 5 things really quick that I want you to take away from letter number 1. Number 1, here's one thing that they say right out of the bat. Thought connects with behavior, okay? Thought connects with behavior. Now, what does he mean by that? Screwtape actually talks about the fact that people used to base their actions on rational, reasonable thought, okay? They used to connect their thinking with what they do, and they would then prepare to alter their life based on that chain of reasoning. There was reasonable thought put into the way that they acted. But then he comes back and says, but now for years, people have had totally incompatible beliefs that do not matter, and they do not care. There's no reasoning involved. So one of the first things that Screwtape tells us that we know is absolutely true is that yes, thought does connect to behavior, but if the enemy can make us think that it doesn't have to, then there's one way that we can be distracted very easily. If what I think and believe doesn't really have any rational thought to it, well, it doesn't really matter if it makes me feel good. Don't we live that way, culturally speaking? Okay? So thought connects to behavior. That's important. Number 2, your words connect with your thoughts. Now that sounds intuitive, but he said it this way. Don't let your patient think in terms of what is true or what is false, but let them think in terms of things that are, well, this is strong, or this is stark, or this is useful, or this, because see, if you follow after what is true, or if you don't follow after what is false, there's no wiggle room there, because something has either got to be true or it has got to be false. There is no writing the line. But if I could make it, well, this is strong, but it doesn't really have to be one way, or well, maybe this is a little weaker, but if we can blur that line and get people away from truth and falsehood, then anything is possible. Because how many times culturally do we get bogged down in I have found myself on so many occasions just wanting to raise my hand in the middle of whatever I'm dealing with going, but that's not true. Nobody cares. Culturally speaking, truth is not what's important. And yet, when you go to 1 Corinthians 13, we're told very clearly that love delights in the truth. It does not delight in that which is false. That's huge. Your words connect to your thoughts. Okay? Number 3. Yes, I took notes. That's why I'm returning the budget. Number 3. Argument connects to your words. So we've got thoughts connect to behavior, words connect to thoughts, argument connects with words, okay? He talked about, and you guys used the word over here, he talked about argument versus propaganda. Did you pick up on that? Okay, argument is a searching for truth. That's how he describes it in the book. So when you hear the word argument, what we're looking at is a search for truth. Propaganda is not a search for truth. Propaganda is, I want to make you act on your emotion.
Right.
And if I want you to act, I'm not going to come to you and tell you the truth of the matter. I'm going to appeal to whatever emotion you've got so that I can get you to get up off your chair and do whatever I want. Why do you think they put that Sarah McLachlan song up against the backdrop of all the puppies that are waiting to be adopted? That's the saddest song on God's green earth. Is it not? That song comes on and immediately you just weep for no reason.
Not
Yeah.
me, I turned the channel.
You turn the channel, good. It's like, I'm done with this. But that was the whole point of it. The whole point of it was to yeah, you're singing it too, I hear you. The whole point of it was to tug at that heartstring and go, oh my gosh, I have to send these people money because that poor dog. Okay? Nobody stops to ask the question, where's the money going? And what are they doing? And did that dog, what? I got questions. Propaganda is not interested in truth. Argument, the way that Lewis writes it, is a search for the truth. So your argument connects to your words.
And that's why the radicals today will not do debates.
In so many different arenas.
They refuse to debate a conservative, a Christian,
Okay.
because they don't have answers, but it's not about arguing,
No.
it's about emotion.
It's about emotion. Okay, I did this with my students today. I asked my students I'm trying to get them to understand what the word criteria means, okay? And some kids right now, that is a word they've never heard before in their life. I've got kids that are very low in English, and these are words that they've never heard. So I'm trying to get them to understand what criteria means. And one of the ways I did it is I asked them a question, like, okay, when you go to Starbucks, because every kid in my high school goes to Starbucks, because then they put one in front of our school, how do you decide what drink you're going to get? And they gave me great answers. Okay, look, you know what criteria are because you have to make a choice. Criteria are those things that you use to help make a decision. So I also asked them, I said, what are the criteria then for how you would decide who to vote for president if you could vote? And then, oh, well, I want them to, and they gave me this laundry list of stuff. It was great. And I said, now you did not describe one word of any politician I've ever met in my life. Because it was, it was hardworking and open-minded and fair. And I'm like, find that in politician. But I asked them this question. I said, how long do you think it takes to elect a president? And they went, voting day? I went, it takes a year. A year? I said, yeah, because first we got to have primaries. We got to figure out who we're going to vote for before we can vote for them. And they're looking at me like I've lost my mind. Like, no, this is what happens. And then after the primaries, we got to figure out, well, who's going to be on this side and who's going to be on this side. And then we get 6 months, not of anybody telling me why they're good for the job, but why the other person sucks for the job. They're awful, and you will be an awful person if you vote for them. That's propaganda. There's no search for truth there. It's just they are evil, and you will be too if you vote for them. And how long has it been that way? As long as I've been alive.
Yep.
Some of y'all are older than me. You can probably test them all.
And people look at the people, not the demons behind the people. That's where the war is.
Oh, honey, demons aren't real. Didn't you know that? They are just metaphors.
Oh, and Harry Potter's not a technical.
They are just metaphors.
Not him.
There's wow, I cannot say the quote because it will get me in trouble, but one of my favorite quotes in any movie, it was actually, and I love horror movies, and I've talked about this before, but one of my favorite quotes in any movie, it comes from one of the Hellraiser movies, and one of the characters is like, the demons are after me, the demons are after me, and the priest character goes, child, demons aren't real, they're just metaphors, and the demon blows the door off the church, and she goes, what the is that? That is awesome, I want that right there. I want that on a t-shirt that I cannot wear out in public, but that is it. That is the one I want. All right, number four. Number four. We talked about this, but it's the pressure of the ordinary. The pressure of the ordinary. Deep thoughts. The deeper we think, these are the ways that Lewis writes that God does get to us, because the deeper we think and the more deeply universal we think about everything, it's going to draw us closer to the truth of who God is. But if the enemy can distract us and keep us away from the deeper thoughts and focused on those ordinary thoughts, those mundane thoughts, if we can create everything that is extraordinary, I love how you said it, if we can make everything that's extraordinary seem like nothing more than just normal, then none of it will matter. And none of it will matter. And that right there is an enemy game plan 101. Because if everything can be normal, then why in the world am I going to fight so hard to say that that's not right? Whatever that may be. The ordinary becomes the normal, and the normal becomes things that we just stop fighting. And it's hard because sometimes the ordinary is what we're called to. And we got to be careful. That's why, thank God, we're never called to do this life alone. We are always called to have people around us that lift us up and pray for us and help us to make it through the day. Because Lord knows if we tried to do it by ourselves, we would all be flat on the ground, face down, and we wouldn't be moving. You ever notice how tragedy likes to hit you when you're at your lowest point sometimes? Mm-hmm. And when it does hit, the first thing we should do is get up and look for the people that we've had around us the whole time. But the first thing we do really is we just retreat. That's it right there. Because what's normal is just to do this. I don't want to burden anybody else. I don't want anybody else to that's not normal. That's the lie. That's the lie. Number 5. And we said it a minute ago. God's abominable advantage. The word says, He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might be called the righteousness of God. The word tells us that God the Son became flesh and dwelt among us. The word also says, and his own did not receive him well. But he came anyway. And the fact that that is the truth of the matter means that every bit of what we're going to walk through, and every bit of what we're going to talk about, and every bit of what we're going to be praying about together as we look at the warfare going on around us, our Savior has the advantage. Because he knows everything that we are tempted by. Because the Bible is clear. He went through it all and yet did not sin. By the way, I hope you understand that it is because of who he is and because of what he was able to do that he was able to be on the cross and be the sacrifice that we need. Why do you think the devil tempted him so hard? Because if he'd have gotten the humanity there to fall just even a little bit, there was no way that he could have been the perfect sacrifice. But he was. And that's why the enemy here says that's the abominable advantage.
And when did he tempt Christ? When he was 40 days into fast.
When he was hangry.
When he was hangry? Yes.
Every time I read that, I was like, I know it's you that
That's right. He was hangry.
Like, I need a snack and a nap.
Like, you know, the disciples had to be like, why are you going out there by yourself for 40 days? Why? I would have asked the question, and he would have told me to shut up. Get behind me, Satan. I know, he would have said it to me at lunchtime. But yeah, he was alone, and he was hungry, and came to him at his lowest point.
Elijah, remember him when he started complaining?
Yes.
The first thing God did, he sent a raven to feed him something. He's like, go to sleep.
Yeah. Snacking and nap. That's it. You got it. Snacks and naps. It's all
Don't
flipping.
underestimate it.
But Elijah was, psychologists have looked at the story of Elijah, and there are many psychologists who have said that he was, by all intents and purposes, clinically depressed. Let's start looking at all the Bible characters that we know about and how completely and utterly not just sinful, but off their rocker. Yes.
True.
And yet he still chose. Jesus still chose to become one of us so that we could be with him. And by the way, let's make sure we get that right. He didn't become one of us so we could become him. He became one of us so we could be with him. And any religion that tells you otherwise is not telling you the truth. Ever. Y'all, that was letter 1. Holy crap, are we going to get to do this in just a semester? Well, here's what we're going to do. I gave you a calendar. Take the calendar and look at it really quick, if you will. We're buttoned up on our time, so here's what we're going to do. On the calendar, I have outlined for you, with one exception, kind of where we're going to go over the next couple months. You will notice that next week, on August 30th, we're going to look at letters 2 and 3. We're going to do a little bit of a letter 1 review. On the 6th, we will not meet. because I cannot be here on the 6th. I have to be at the school that night because we have to meet with all of the parents of all of our medical students, and I have to do that until about 8, 9 o'clock. So I will be there instead of being here, and y'all will have to pray for me because I will, it's going to be hard. But after that, we kind of go straight through. You can see we get to Thanksgiving, and by the time we get to Thanksgiving, we've actually made it through all 31 letters. Now we may actually pick up, depending on how things go. My plan is this. My plan is to be done with the entire book right before Thanksgiving, and when we come back from Thanksgiving, we've only got 2 weeks after that. The 1 week that's not on here is December the 6th, okay? So if you'll write it on there, December the 6th is the last day for the semester here. My goal for the last 2 weeks is we are going to look together at the most updated version of this story that I have seen or heard of to date. And if you haven't seen it, we're going to look at it together. We're going to watch the movie Nefarious. Okay? If you have seen it, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't seen it, you're in for something really amazing. I've got it scheduled to do part 1 on the first week and part 2 on the second week. We'll see how that goes. But it is quite possibly the best version of this story I've seen on screen ever. And it's a shame, in all honesty, it's a shame that Sean Patrick Flannery will never be lauded for his work because he deserves an Oscar for his performance. It is absolutely fantastic. So if you have seen it, great. If you haven't seen it, I'm not telling you not to watch it, but we're going to look at it together because I think it bears some discussion as well. So when we get to that point, we're going to do that. But this is it. This is kind of mapping it out. So next week, if you will do me this favor, come back next week having read letters 2 and 3 and look at I gave you all the questions, okay? I'm giving you the questions ahead of time because I want you to come next week having looked at letters 2 and 3 and having looked at the questions so that we can have some really rich discussion, okay? It's 7:30. I'm going to pray, and we're going to all go pick up our kids, those of us that have them. Thank you, Jesus, for this wonderful time tonight. Thank you for all of these amazing people that are here. I thank you that we got to make some new friends tonight. Lord Jesus, I pray that you would bring us all back together next week. I pray that we would continue to have a richness of our time together. And for those who couldn't be here tonight, Father, and wanted to be, I pray that you would bring them together with us next week. But Father, I ask you right now that you would put your holy armor on us as we leave, because the enemy does not like it when we start to reveal the plans that he has. And Father, I know that you have given us an insight at times into what the enemy wants and tries to take from us. But Father, I pray that you would protect and guard every person in this room, guard their heart, guard their mind, and their families, Father, because when we start looking at the tactics of the enemy does not like it, and we know he doesn't like it, and we know he will come after us. So Father, right now I pray that we would all be on our guard, and that we would all pray for everybody else in this room. Lord Jesus, if anybody made a new friend tonight, I pray that they would pray for that new friend tonight, and that we would all pray for each other. And Lord Jesus, I pray that you would continue to cover my family and just help me as we continue to lead this. And I'm so grateful for it. We love you, Jesus, and we ask all this in your precious holy name. Amen.